Although the Gang of 19's action was a great success, the movement was just beginning. For the next 8 years, Wade and his fellow activists strategized, organized, and mobilized, quietly but surely moving the needle of accessibility. In 1983, along with co-founder Michael Auberger, Wade created ADAPT. Several leaders emerged along the way, including Babs Johnson, who's dubbed the mother of the organization.
ADAPT was American Disabled for Accessible Public Transportation. Nice acronym. There was a period when it was referred to as Atlantis/ADAPT. People were concerned. Atlantis had a number of grants, and ADAPT attacked the very institutions that gave them the grants. There had to be some more of a separation.
So that leads to his recognition that a nonprofit wasn't necessarily the best vehicle. So an activist group, much more of a out in the world advocating group, would be the key next stage with this. So that leads to the formation of the group ADAPT. To have its full impact, this will have to be literally go to the streets with this and go and get on the news and be very visible.
RTD fought it tooth and nail. They did not want these buses to be accessible, so as much as they fought, ADAPT fought harder.
We, of course, continued the lawsuit and ultimately won the lawsuit, and the very buses that the judge said we couldn't have made accessible are all accessible, and we quickly, through courts and protest, made Denver the most accessible city in the nation, maybe the world at that time.
Strategically, ADAPT chapters across the country began popping up, and the American Public Transportation Association, or APTA, whose members are the public transportation districts from across the country, became their prime target.
Public transit is about the common good. It's about community well-being, and people who are planning to be oppressive and narrow don't go into that line of work, and yet they fall into their habits. This is what we do. This is the buses. These are the people who get on the buses. But it's still, at its bedrock, the American Public Transit Association is about doing something on behalf of the common good and the public welfare.
Accessible to all Americans, not just able-bodied. We demonstrate at every conference or convention of the American Public Transit Association because this group in 1979 sued to have the regulation rescinded that required that all buses be lift-equipped. In 1980, APTA won that suit.
Fail to keep your wheelchair on the sidewalk, you are subject to arrest.
Wade was an excellent organizer. Sort of did some undercover kind of work of buildings, where they were going to demonstrate. He would, survey them to make sure which door to go into. People would demonstrate outside. And then someone, a non-disabled person, might open the door, and then someone with a disability would go right in, tie up the door, and then other people would go in and then take over the building. And it was very effective, and it was done very quickly. The American Public Transportation Association, they have an annual conference, and whenever they met, ADAPT would meet because they wanted every bus in the country to be accessible.
And sometimes they just do amazing things, like they shut down the American Transit Association, I think in Vegas, and then again in Hawaii. They made those conventions fail and turned the focus to the movement. We want what we want. That's a great philosophy for winning a revolutionary movement.
Instead of a group of people being characterized by how other people see them, with that idea of who they are imposed from outside, that notion of taking control of self-presentation. That's a really important part of civil rights movements, to take possession of what has been a characterization imposed from outside on a group and to say, actually, this is who we are. We may have been portrayed as passive and weak and sickly, but that actually isn't who we are. That turns out to be almost as important as anything Congress does.
Parallel to the social actions and protests on the ground, legal advocates were pushing for legislative reform. APTA actions, curb cuts, sit-ins, civil disobedience across the country. ADAPT was relentless. Everything needed to be accessible. Buses, sidewalks, buildings, jobs, and the formula that worked was to protest, sue, and get as much media attention as possible.
One of our first victories was with McDonald's. So Atlantis was getting phone calls. We know what you're doing in Denver. We want to do that here. So they took that training opportunity, invited some people from Utah and from different places in the country. They came to Denver and they organized a protest at McDonald's.
People were having lunch and then someone said, hey, wait, we can't get to the counter, it's not accessible. And so they had an impromptu demonstration, like Wade would say, all right, now let's have an action. And so it's improvised, but it was showing people that what they can do. The press came and it became an issue.
It didn't take the McDonald's people long to realize what was going on. The CEO came to Denver and Katie helped come up with those demands, and that we'd be able to use the restroom and access to the counter to order our food. So that was in the very beginning, long before the ADA. I love to tell this part of the history because, when, they knew eventually that the work would happen. McDonald's was ready to negotiate, and so when the CEO came to meet, one of the things was in their advertising to promote people with disabilities. And we always say they don't let us write the scripts, but that was part of the advocacy.
Atlantis now had 20 or 25 people in the Sun Valley Project, and all of them were more than thrilled to be plaintiffs. So we began the suit with 20 or 30 or 40 individuals who were Heritage House refugees. But we said, and they sued for damages, because once you move, you can't sue to change it, you just can sue for how they hurt you. And then all of the workers who'd been fired with Wade came in and sang very loud songs about what they'd seen and heard. And pretty soon that facility was in bankruptcy. My theory was that if no one would take the time to write Michael Patrick Smith's poetry down, then it must be because we don't care and we're not inspecting. And we claimed every nursing home resident had a right to high-quality medical, nursing, psychosocial care in a safe, sanitary, rehabilitatively supportive environment that promotes all civil rights. That was our definition of the rights violation. Of course, Heritage House evicted Michael Patrick Smith as a retaliation. So Wade and I took Michael in a bed, because he was from Denver General, to federal court, and we put him on to testify from a bed. And then we just built the case and built the case and built the case till it was millions of documents, and to the Secretary of Health and Human Services, and took down the national inspection system. The Michael Patrick Smith, he died on my birthday, which pissed me off permanently. So we never stopped his case till we won that and got a national inspection system.
In addition to changing the national nursing home inspection system, John Holland and his team went after the individuals who owned Heritage House, seeking damages for their refugees.
And one of the owners got up in court and said, well, we gave them candy and they had a roof over their heads. And we closed their building and made them pay. We divided it up with everybody. And it was fun because Medicaid rules were such that you couldn't have money for more than 30 days in a bank account and still be eligible, and all these people had to be eligible. But you could own a home of any value. You could have $1 million home and be on Medicaid. So we just bought 20 homes. So it was an interesting adventure with Wade.
Nothing more fascinating, really, in American history than how local grassroots movements move around, and then it goes national, and then Congress wakes up and gets going on it. So that is not an easy progression, but it's quite something.
Finally, the Americans with Disabilities Act was introduced to Congress in 1988, but quickly stagnated. Desperately and passionately fighting for their rights, ADAPT and other activists descended on Washington, D.C. on March 12, 1990, with what is now dubbed the Capitol Crawl.
ADAPT activists are very sophisticated. They're activists from way back, and they understand the optics of disability protests. So the scene of disabled people without use of their legs crawling up the National Capitol steps in support of the ADA is a powerful image that Americans are not going to watch dispassionately.
Hundreds of people got out of their chairs and tried to get up the steps to the Capitol. And that was really, really, really embarrassing. Ted Kennedy, who was a big sponsor of the bill, and George Bush first came up to the steps and told the movement leadership that if they'd call off the protests, they'd sign the bill. And so the ADA was passed to end a protest that began with the Gang of 19, basically. The ADA was a comprehensive bill, and all the bills that we'd sued on and demonstrated around and used to do legal actions were candles in a huge crescendo lighting up the world. It had to think about everything from police services to wheelchair access on airplanes to every form of government activity, and the right to be in the world expanding into services and equal treatment.
This was like a civil rights bill. Your average person on the street had no idea what ADA was and the ramifications of it. The weapon was always ADAPT, but you also had a lot of people like Justin Dart. His father was, I think, president of Kraft Foods. You had a number of players working on it simultaneously, a lot of people from Berkeley. ADAPT was always the army, so to speak, in waiting. It was indeed revolutionary.
One of the things that the ADA did for me is to outline that I was discriminated against, because what I used before that is just that gut feeling of that's not right.
It's not just for people with physical disabilities. It's all disabilities. So whether someone has an intellectual and developmental disability, a physical disability, a mental health condition, a traumatic brain injury, the ADA is really designed to provide civil rights for all people with all disabilities. Post-ADA, the requirement is that businesses have that accessibility so people can get to the grocery store, go see a movie, or get out into the community, that can get on and off of sidewalks. It's helped. It's not perfect. There's still a lot of work to be done.
Even though the ADA passed, change did not happen overnight, and ADAPT, its sister organization Atlantis Community, and other advocacy groups like Colorado Cross Disability Coalition continued to fight for a better quality of life for their community. As access to public transportation slowly resolved, ADAPT adapted and changed its acronym to American Disabled for Attendant Programs today. In 1993, ADAPT faced a huge loss. Wade Blank, just as he had predicted, died young at age 53, swimming in Mexico with his son. His wife and daughter witnessed the event.
It was very important to him that no matter what happens, that he wanted to know that as long as we needed this sort of activism, that there is leadership that provides that opportunity. And the feedback that I get from my friends that were part of this was the absolute thing that they knew that was a must, is that the work continue to move forward, because that was so important to him. That was his main goal, is that no matter what, that our work be able to continue.
The work did and does continue, protesting with the same methods Wade developed decades earlier.
There was still problems with attendant services, and that fight has been going on now for 15, 20 years, trying to get some sort of universal policy that people with disabilities, wherever they live in the United States, get the services they need to live independently.
Which has happened. The work has to continue, right? And we saw some efforts, from the Gang of 19 and how they were able to organize the nation, basically. But what's beautiful is that it started right here in Colorado. So how did we see them fight back? What were some tools that they used? What you got?
They help with transportation to help them use their ability to go on and off the transportation.
Yeah, absolutely. So they focused on transportation, right? What did you see them do in order to get the attention of the people that made the decisions about our transportation system?
They contacted the people who was running the transportation, and they wanted to have the skills of all the people there to help them to have the transportation that is going to be needed.
Yeah, absolutely. So they definitely got a lot of people together with different skills, different resources. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you, Michael. Did you want to expand on that, Ashley? Go ahead.
So not only did they climb up the Capitol building, and they made a huge change, both, I think, liberally, and I think it's really cool how they use their situation and their physical bodies to stop a moving vehicle to make a change.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for that. Thank you for that. And that's scary work. You know what I mean? Yeah. It's definitely scary work to put your body literally on the line. They would lay out in front of the buses. They would go into buildings and, they would tie up the doors of the building. They would go into places like McDonald's and they would stand by the counters so that it wasn't accessible for people that were considered to be able-bodied, right? And so they made it very clear that the inconvenience that they face every single day, because the world was designed or was not designed with their convenience in mind, right? That they were going to show everybody else what it's like to not be able to go into these spaces and use the restroom, or to order food at a counter, or to be able to even walk into, to be able to get into a building, right? Yes. Every single day, that was their reality. And so they had to make it very clear for everybody else what their reality was in order for there to be some type of change. And so this has happened in a bunch of different movements. We've seen people at Standing Rock, literally create human chains, right? And guard the earth with their bodies. We have seen, unfortunately, in thinking about things like the Children's March, where Martin Luther King literally asked a group of Black people who would be willing to get arrested to fight for equality. And the only people that actually offered themselves were the children. And they decided to march, they decided to protest, and they knew that they were going to get arrested. They didn't know, though, that there were going to be attack dogs. They didn't know that there were going to be hoses that they were going to be using against their bodies. But that's literally one of the only reasons why we have the Civil Rights Act, is because the children decided to put their bodies on the line. And so I'm not telling you to go and put your bodies on the line. But we do have to discuss what is necessary sometimes to make these changes, right? It's very important that we have people on the inside working on policy, working with some of our legislators to make some of these changes. But one of the things that actually makes this thing happen is the visibility of it. If people can't see what's going on, if they're not made uncomfortable, they're not going to be willing to change anything about it. And so I know a lot of times people like to quote Martin Luther King about, being nonviolent in his approach, and understanding that darkness can't drive out hate, only light can do that, and things like that. But unfortunately, a lot of times people don't recognize that Martin Luther King is the same person that said that riots were the language of the unheard. Because after a while, I can't just keep speaking. After a while, I can't just keep yelling. After a while, I can't just keep shouting. After a while, I have to do something that shows you, that makes it visible, that makes it uncomfortable for you to live, because it's uncomfortable for me to live every day. Does that make sense?